It was the summer of 2013, and I was 27 years old. I had taken some time off work, not because I had something important to do, but because I just needed to get away. I worked long hours in a factory near Albany, New York, and my back was always aching from lifting crates. I didn't really have a social life anymore. My girlfriend had broken up with me the winter before, and since then, my apartment had started to feel smaller every day. I had this old habit from when I was a kid. I used to go camping alone. My dad had taken me out into the woods a lot when I was younger. We never stayed anywhere too fancy, just some place off the road, maybe near a stream, where we could build a fire and feel like we were out in the wild. Those were the best memories I had of him before he passed away. So sometimes, when things got too loud or too tight in my life, I'd pack up my gear and head out into the middle of nowhere. That summer, I felt like disappearing for a few days. I looked around on old forums and maps, trying to find somewhere quiet and out of the way, someplace where I wouldn't see a single person. I came across a thread on a hiking site about forgotten graveyards in Maine. Most people were sharing photos, but there was one comment buried deep in a thread that caught my eye. A guy mentioned an abandoned cemetery up in the hills near a small town called Weld. He said the graveyard hadn't been used in over 70 years and wasn't even on most modern maps. It had been tied to a tiny church that had burned down in the 60s. Supposedly, it was a small plot of land hidden deep in the trees, fenced off by old rusted iron, the stones all half swallowed by the woods. Something about that idea, camping in a graveyard, felt different. It felt stupid too, but it also felt like the kind of stupid I needed. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits or anything like that. I just wanted silence, and no one would bother looking for me there. I packed up my gear, filled the car with gas, and took off early one Saturday morning. It was a 6-hour drive into Maine. The roads got thinner and more cracked the farther I went. By the time I passed through Weld, it felt like I'd stepped into a town that time had passed by. Just one gas station, a post office, a diner with a Pepsi sign hanging off a rusted chain. I kept going north, following an old logging road that barely looked drivable. I parked my car about 2 miles from where I thought the cemetery was supposed to be and walked the rest of the way in. The woods were thick, all dark green and shadow. The trees grew close together, and the trail was more like a suggestion than an actual path. I had to stop a few times to check my GPS, and even then, it was mostly guesswork. Eventually, I found it, or at least what was left of it. The iron gate was real. It was bent and brown with rust, leaning to one side like it wanted to fall but hadn't gotten around to it yet. Vines curled up the bars, and a thick carpet of leaves and moss covered the ground. I stepped inside. The cemetery wasn't big, maybe 30, 40 stones at most. Some were broken. A few were so worn down I couldn't read the names. Others had tilted sideways or sunk into the dirt. Trees had started to grow between the graves, their roots curling around the stone like they were trying to pull them down. I picked a flat spot in the corner, far away from the denser clusters of graves, and set up my tent. It was a simple one-man tent, the kind I'd had since college. I didn't plan on building a fire. The woods were too dry, and I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I had a flashlight, a knife, a few cans of food, a water filter, and a sleeping bag. That was enough. The first night was quiet. A few bugs buzzing, some rustling in the trees, but nothing out of the ordinary. It actually felt peaceful. I ate a cold can of chili, listened to the wind scrape the branches overhead, and tried to relax. I was asleep by 10. I woke up around 3 in the morning, though I didn't know why. It wasn't a noise that did it, at least not one I could name. I just opened my eyes and knew something felt off. The tent was zipped shut. I was warm enough, but something about the air had changed. It was thicker, stiller, like the forest had stopped breathing. I sat up and stayed like that for a while, just listening. No birds, no bugs, just silence. That's the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on. The inside of the tent looked normal. I unzipped the flap slowly and poked my head out. Everything looked the same. Nothing had moved. My gear was in place. The graveyard was still there, still quiet. I stepped out, barefoot, and walked a few feet. The beam of my flashlight caught the edge of a headstone. The moss on it glowed slightly under the light. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Then I saw it. A shape, way off in the dark, near the edge of the graveyard. Not an animal, not a shadow. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there. I froze. My hand tightened around the flashlight. I held my breath. I must have stood like that for 2, maybe 3 minutes, not blinking. But the shape didn't move. I backed into my tent, zipped it up fast, and didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I thought maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was a tree stump or a trick of the light. I was tired. I hadn't been sleeping well for weeks. I shook it off, ate breakfast, and spent most of the day hiking around the area. The hills around the graveyard were steep, and there were no trails. I found the old stone foundation of what must have been the church. Just a few broken blocks, some scattered wood buried under leaves. I found no signs of recent activity. No footprints, no beer cans, no signs of teenagers sneaking in. Just trees and rot. The second night was worse. Started the same, quiet, calm. But around midnight, I started hearing footsteps. Soft ones, somewhere in the brush behind the graves. They weren't fast. They weren't loud. Just slow, careful steps, one after the other. I lay in my tent, holding my knife, listening. They stopped and circled around. I knew it wasn't an animal. Animals don't walk in patterns. These steps were being made by someone trying not to be heard. I turned off my flashlight and stayed still until the sun came up. When I crawled out, there were no tracks. The ground was too dry, covered in leaves. But I knew what I heard. I should have left then, but I didn't. I told myself I was being paranoid, that someone had just passed through. Maybe a hunter, maybe a hiker. I stayed one more night. That night changed everything. I didn't sleep. I sat up, knife in hand, listening. The woods were silent again, even more than before. Around 2 a.m., I saw a light. It wasn't a flashlight. It was a small, faint flicker, like a candle or an old lantern. It came from beyond the trees behind the graves. It moved slowly. It disappeared behind one tree, then reappeared behind another. I watched it for half an hour. Then I heard the steps again. This time they came closer. I held my breath, leaned out of the tent just enough to peek. The light stopped. The footsteps stopped. Then someone whispered. I couldn't make out the words, but I know I heard it. A man's voice, low and cracked, like someone who hadn't spoken in a long time. He was close, just on the other side of the fence. I didn't move. My heart was pounding in my ears. I stayed like that until dawn. When the sky turned gray, I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't even fold the tent right. I just jammed it into my pack. I didn't look back at the graves. I didn't want to know if someone was watching me from behind one of the stones. I just walked miles through the woods until I reached my car. When I got in, my hands were shaking. I locked the doors before I even turned the key. I didn't stop until I was on the highway headed south, away from the hills, away from the trees. I don't know who was out there. I don't know if they live in those woods, or if they just happened to be there the same weekend I was. But I do know this, whoever they were, they didn't want me there. That graveyard isn't empty. It's not haunted. It's just hidden, forgotten, and someone still goes there. Maybe someone who doesn't want it found. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still think about that graveyard, about the shape in the dark, the light, the footsteps, the whisper. I never went back. I never will. and I never told anyone until now. My name's Tom. I'm 31 now, but this happened when I was 28. It was the summer of 2022, early July. I had just quit a job I hated and wanted a break from everything. Phones, traffic, people, all of it. So I planned a solo camping trip in the North York Moors, a quiet area of England most people don't talk about unless they're into walking trails or old villages. I picked it because it was peaceful, not crowded, and felt far away from my usual life in Birmingham. I wasn't much of an outdoors guy, but I knew enough. I had a decent two-man tent, a roll mat, and a thick sleeping bag that I'd only used twice before. I brought all the usual gear: gas stove, small pan, water tablets, a knife, snacks, thermal clothes, a torch, first aid kit, and one of those foldable solar battery packs for emergencies. I planned to camp for 5 nights. No hotels, no hostels, just me and my tent near some quiet walking paths. I'd marked a few on a paper map and figured I'd hike most of the day, set up camp before dark, cook something simple, then rest. The first 2 days went fine. I didn't see many people on the trails. The weather was better than I expected. Some wind, but no rain. The sky was cloudy, but I didn't mind. The air was fresh. I slept well both nights and woke up early. I felt calm, the way I'd hoped I would. I journaled, took pictures, sat by little streams with my boots off. It felt like a slow, quiet kind of freedom I hadn't had in years. On the 3rd day, I hiked farther west than I'd planned. I got carried away because the trail was easy and the scenery was better than I thought it would be. Rolling hills, patches of heather, birds cutting across the wind. I passed a crumbling stone wall, and then a long abandoned farmhouse without a roof. I remember checking the map and seeing I was about half a mile from a spot marked Dean's Hollow. I hadn't noticed that name before, but the name stuck with me. That night, I set up camp near a thin tree line that edged a dip in the land. It wasn't a proper forest, just a dozen or so trees spaced wide apart. Beyond that, the ground sloped down into a shallow hollow. I pitched the tent facing away from the trees. I cooked dinner, beans and rice, washed my pan in a nearby stream, and sat for a while, looking at the low clouds roll across the hills. It was around 9:30 p.m. when I noticed something strange. I was standing about 10 feet from my tent, brushing my teeth, when I saw movement among the trees behind me. I froze. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but I kept still and squinted, and I swear I saw a man. He was standing behind one of the trees, mostly still, just far enough that I couldn't make out his face. He didn't step out or wave or say anything. He was just standing there, not walking, not doing anything, just watching. I stood there, toothbrush in hand, for at least a minute. I felt stupid. Maybe it was a tree trunk or a shadow, but I had that feeling, the deep kind that doesn't come from guessing. It comes from knowing. I knew someone was standing there. I felt it in my chest. I turned around slowly, went back to my tent, and zipped it closed. I didn't turn off the torch. I sat cross-legged on my mat and listened. The wind picked up a little, brushing the sides of the tent. I told myself I was being paranoid. People walk trails all the time. Maybe he was just passing through. Still, I didn't sleep well that night. Every time a twig snapped or the wind rustled the grass, I woke up. By morning, I was annoyed at myself. I checked outside. No sign of anyone. I walked back toward the trees. No footprints, no broken branches. The ground was dry. It didn't look like anyone had passed through at all. I felt like a fool. I packed up and told myself to forget about it. I hiked east again that day, back toward where I'd started. I didn't see a single person. The paths were empty and I liked it that way. I found a small valley with a wide clearing and a patch of trees on the far side. I set up camp at the edge of the trees, close enough for wind cover but far enough to see my surroundings. It was a better spot than the night before, open and calm. But just after 10 p.m., I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy ones. I had just turned off the stove and was crouching near the tent. The sound came from behind me, from inside the trees. Not fast, not rushed, just deliberate. Crunch, crunch, crunch. I turned with my torch and scanned the tree line. Nothing. I stood still for a long time. The wind had stopped, and everything was quiet. I shined the torch again, sweeping it slowly. On the second pass, I caught a glimpse, someone ducking behind a tree. This time, there was no doubt. It was a person, too tall to be a kid, thin, wearing something dark. I didn't yell. I didn't do anything. I turned, crawled into my tent, and zipped it shut. I kept the torch on and my knife close. I didn't sleep at all that night. At some point, maybe around 1 or 2 a.m., I heard more footsteps. A slow circling sound, like someone walking around the edge of the clearing. I didn't move. My heart felt like it was beating in my throat. By sunrise, everything was quiet again. I stepped out, looked around. Still no one. I packed my gear faster than I ever had in my life and started walking. I didn't even eat breakfast. That day, I didn't follow any trail. I just walked. I moved south, off the main path, through grass and patches of woods. I wanted to be far from wherever that man was. I kept checking behind me, expecting to see him standing there again, half hidden, watching, but I didn't see anything. Still, I had that feeling, that cold, crawling one, where you know something's not right. I hiked until my legs ached. Around 6 p.m., I found a flat spot near a thin stream and pitched the tent. I was too tired to keep going. My feet were sore, and my back burned from the pack weight. I didn't cook. I didn't wash up. I just drank water, locked myself in the tent, and sat in the dark. This time, I stayed awake. I didn't want to sleep. I sat for hours listening. Around 11 p.m., I heard something again, something soft. It wasn't footsteps. It was quieter, like grass being brushed aside. I held my breath and turned the torch toward the entrance of the tent, waiting for a shadow or sound. But nothing happened. Eventually, I must have dozed off because I woke to daylight. My limbs were stiff and I had a sharp pain in my right shoulder. I packed up slowly, checked the area. There was no sign of anything unusual. I even checked for footprints again, but the grass had bounced back. It was like nothing had happened, but I knew what I heard. I knew someone had been there. The last night, I camped near a wide gravel trail. I figured it was safer, more open, with fewer trees. I pitched the tent facing the path and tried to rest. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Even before dark, I felt watched. I set small markers, sticks placed in patterns, around the tent to see if anything moved. I even tied a small strip of cloth to one tree to catch movement. At some point that night, probably past midnight, I heard someone breathe outside my tent. Not footsteps, not animals, just breathing. Slow, heavy, human, right on the other side of the thin nylon wall. I held my breath. I didn't move. I waited. It lasted maybe 20 seconds. Then silence. Then a faint rustle, someone walking away. When I finally got the courage to look, nothing had changed. But the strip of cloth I'd tied up, gone. Just gone. That was enough for me. I left before sunrise. I walked for miles until I hit a car park with 2 parked vans. I sat on a bench, dead tired, and waited until someone came by. I didn't explain much, just asked for a lift to the nearest village. From there, I took a train home. I never found out who it was. I never told anyone the full story. I didn't file a report. I didn't see any crimes happen. I just knew someone had followed me, watched me, came closer every night. Whoever it was, they didn't want to talk. They didn't want to rob me. They just wanted to scare me. Or worse, since then, I haven't gone camping again. I've walked in parks and done short hikes, but I stay near towns. I keep my phone charged. I don't sleep in tents anymore. I still wonder what he wanted. What would have happened if I had stayed one more night, or left my tent, or called out? Sometimes I see someone on the street, in a shop, or by the road, and I feel that same cold, crawling feeling on the back of my neck. I remind myself it's probably no one, but I never forget that breathing. Not ever. It was September of 2017 when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the forests of southern Oregon. I had just turned 32 and was looking for something quiet, somewhere to disconnect from the stress of work and life in Portland. I wasn't running away from anything. I just needed air. No phone, no noise, no people. That's what I told myself anyway. I took my old green Ford Ranger and packed it with everything I needed: tent, tarp, small cooler, some freeze-dried food, fire-starting gear, a hatchet, a basic first aid kit, a .22 rifle for small game or just for comfort, and a thick wool blanket. I didn't bring a GPS. I had paper maps, and I liked the idea of being off-grid for a few days. I'd grown up doing this kind of thing with my dad, but this would be my first time completely alone in a place I'd never been before. I left on a Tuesday morning. It was cool and dry, the kind of early autumn day that makes you feel like something is coming. Something you can't name, just sense. I drove for 6 hours, passed through a few little towns I'd never heard of, and eventually turned off the main highway onto a gravel road that led deeper into the national forest. The road twisted and climbed, dipped, and narrowed until it was barely more than a track through the trees. About 40 minutes up that road, I found a small clearing just off a side path. The spot was perfect, flat, with a ring of tall pines around it, and no sign anyone had camped there recently. I parked the truck, unloaded my gear, and got to work setting up. I pitched the tent under a large fir and tied a tarp between two trees for a dry sitting area. I stacked some firewood from a dead tree nearby and cleared a fire circle. I spent that first evening collecting kindling and exploring the area around camp. I followed a small game trail for about 20 minutes before it split into several thin paths. I didn't want to get lost on my first day, so I turned back. By sunset, I had a small fire going and cooked some instant noodles over it. As the light faded, the forest got quieter. There was no wind.
No frags.
Just the fire crackling and the occasional snap of a branch far off in the trees. It was dark by 8. I sat for a while with a flashlight on my lap, staring into the woods, watching shadows. Eventually, I crawled into the tent, zipped up the flap, and lay back with my hands behind my head. I could hear my heartbeat. Every little noise felt louder out there. Leaves shifting, something thudding against the ground far off. I wasn't scared exactly, just alert. Too alert to sleep for a long time. I finally drifted off sometime after midnight. I woke up to silence and gray light. The forest was calm again. Cold air moved over my face as I unzipped the tent. I stepped out into dew-covered grass and stretched. I made instant coffee on my small camp stove, then walked the perimeter of my site, just getting a feel for things again. There were some tracks in the dirt that hadn't been there the night before. At first I figured they were mine, but they didn't match my boots. These were smaller and pressed deep, like someone moving fast. Could have been a deer. I told myself it was a deer. Later that day, I hiked further out, deeper than before. I didn't take the rifle because I didn't plan to be out long. I had a basic compass, my pocket knife, a granola bar, and my phone just for the clock. I followed a narrow trail past some old stumps, down into a gully where the air felt cooler and heavier. I kept going until I reached a dry creek bed littered with bones. Mostly animal, I thought. A few rib cages, some skulls, all picked clean. I crouched there for a few minutes just looking, then headed back the way I came. I remember getting turned around near a rotten log I didn't recognize. For a few minutes, I wasn't sure if I was walking in circles. I took a deep breath, checked my compass, and adjusted east. Eventually, I saw my tarp through the trees. I was only gone about 3 hours total, but it was enough to make me uneasy. Something about that bone pile didn't sit right with me. That night, I kept the fire going later. I didn't want to be in the tent too early. I sat with the rifle beside me and the flashlight pointed at the tree line. I kept thinking about those other tracks. Not animal. Too narrow. Too deliberate. Around 10, I heard a noise behind my tent. It wasn't loud, just a slow rustle, like someone brushing up against the tent fabric. I froze. I didn't shine my light. I just sat still, listening. The noise didn't come again. I waited another hour before going to bed, but I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those bones. On the third day, I woke up late. My back was sore. I stepped out of the tent and immediately noticed something wrong. A bundle of sticks had been placed in the fire circle, tied together with some kind of cord. Thin plastic. Blue. Not mine. I didn't say anything. I just stood there for a long time, staring at it. I walked around the perimeter again. I looked for signs. Nothing obvious. No fresh tracks. No marks on trees. But I knew someone had been there. I packed up my gear slowly, quietly. I wasn't planning to leave that day, but now I was. I loaded everything back into the truck except the tent. I left it standing while I sat in the cab and looked at the map. My hands were shaking. I didn't know why. I camped in places with bears, with cougars. I'd never felt like this, like I was being watched. Not by an animal, but by someone who knew the woods better than I did. I finally got out and took down the tent. As I rolled it up, I saw something in the grass. A small, rusted folding knife. Old, the blade half open. I didn't touch it. I just stood and left it there. I drove out fast. The gravel road bounced the truck hard, but I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. I kept going until I reached a rest stop near Grants Pass. I parked, got out, and sat on the curb, staring at my hands. I stayed in a motel that night. Couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that stick bundle, the cord, the way it was placed like it meant something. I thought maybe it was a warning or a game. I kept trying to convince myself it was just a local screwing with me. Someone saw the smoke from my fire and decided to have fun. But it didn't feel like that. It felt colder than that. A few days later, I told a friend what happened. He said I probably stumbled onto someone's hunting ground. Maybe someone squatting out there, living rough. I didn't disagree, but something about the way the forest felt, like it was hiding someone, not something. I didn't go back to that area. Not ever. And sometimes I dream about the knife. Not the one I found, but another one. In someone's hand, just outside my tent. That's what sticks with me. Not what I saw, but what I didn't see. What was waiting there. Just quiet. Watching. Closer than I thought. I was 33 when I finally took a solo camping trip I had been putting off for years. Life had always gotten in the way, work, relationships, one thing or another. But by the summer of 2014, I had a bit more time on my hands. My contract with a local construction firm had ended early, and instead of rushing to find something new, I took a week for myself. I hadn't really done that before. I lived just outside of Derby at the time, in a little place called Belper. It was far enough from the city that things stayed quiet, but close enough that I could hop on the A6 and drive out into the countryside without much effort. That's what I did that Tuesday morning. I packed my car with gear, tent, sleeping bag, stove, water, torch, boots, the usual, and I headed east, away from the towns, toward the edge of the Peak District. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. I just wanted space. I had a map and a couple of printed trail guides. No phone signal was common in some parts out there, but I wasn't planning on going too deep. My idea was to find somewhere remote, set up camp for 3 nights, read a bit, walk a bit, cook my own food, and think. Nothing fancy. The spot I picked wasn't even marked properly on the map. It was just north of a place called Worksworth, close to an old disused limestone quarry. I'd read online about people wild camping near the edge of the woodlands in that area, and it didn't seem like a popular spot, which suited me. I parked my car about a mile away near a lay-by and hiked the rest of the way in, taking a winding path that ran parallel to a shallow stream. By the time I reached the area I had in mind, the sun was already starting to dip. It was a beautiful open patch of flat ground, just inside the tree line. One side was shielded by thick trees, the other sloped slightly down toward a wide ridge that overlooked the edge of the quarry. The quarry itself was maybe another 200 yards down from the ridge, hidden by trees and scrub. I could hear birds and the soft rustle of leaves. Nothing else. It was quiet in the best way. I set up the tent without rushing, made a small dinner on the portable stove, just some beans and rice, and sat on a fold-up stool with my torch clipped to the top of the tent, reading a book I brought. The first night passed without anything unusual. I slept lightly, the way I always do when I'm outside, but I wasn't nervous. On the second day, I took a long walk east, just to explore. I followed a dry stone wall that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, climbed over a few low gates, passed some sheep, and made my way to a narrow clearing where someone had once put up a wooden hunting blind. It was rotting and covered in moss. I sat up there for a while with a flask of tea and just watched the woods. I didn't see anyone the whole time I was out, not even from a distance. When I got back to camp in the late afternoon, I noticed something small but strange. A flattened patch of grass about 10 yards behind my tent, just past the line of trees. It looked fresh. The grass was bent clean like someone had sat or stood there. It wasn't there when I left that morning. I would have noticed. I didn't make a big deal of it. Probably a deer or badger, I thought. Still, I did a slow circle around the site before cooking dinner, just looking for anything else out of place. I didn't find anything. That night, the feeling changed. At around 2:30 a.m., I woke up to a sound. Something moving just beyond the tent. Not loud, not violent. Just slow steps, crunching leaves, careful ones. I didn't move at first. I kept my breathing steady and stayed still inside my sleeping bag. The steps circled the tent once, maybe twice. I couldn't tell if it was an animal or not. It stopped after a few minutes, and I waited for a long time, listening. Nothing. Eventually, I must have dozed off again. In the morning, I found 3 cigarette butts on the ground just a few feet from the tent flap. They weren't there the day before. That much I knew for certain. I don't smoke. They were still a little moist, like they hadn't been there long. Someone had stood right by the tent in the night. Now I was uneasy. I packed up most of my things and left them in the tent, but took a walk toward the edge of the quarry. I wanted to check the area before making any decisions about staying another night. The trees thinned as I got closer, and the edge of the quarry came into view. A long, steep drop into gray, chalky rock. It was fenced off with old, rusted metal panels in places, though many had fallen down. Then I saw it. Across the quarry, maybe 200 meters away on the opposite ridge, was a small metal shack. I hadn't noticed it before. It blended in with the rock and shadows. It looked like one of those old site storage buildings left behind after construction. But the strange thing was, there was smoke rising from behind it, thin, faint, almost invisible if the sun wasn't catching it. Someone was there, and I was sure they'd seen me. I backed away slowly and returned to the tent. I didn't see anyone on the way back, but I didn't feel comfortable anymore. I didn't want to panic, but it was clear I wasn't alone out there. Someone had walked around my tent in the night and left cigarette butts, and now there was an active shelter just across the quarry. That wasn't part of my plan. I decided to stay one more night, but I moved my tent. Instead of sleeping where I had the previous nights, I packed up and shifted everything about 300 yards south into thicker woods. I left the original site looking as if I was still there. I even placed a folded shirt over a rock near the tent entrance, hoping it would look like someone resting or sitting there. It was a weak trick, but I wanted whoever was creeping around to think I hadn't noticed anything. The new site was darker, denser, and colder. I had to clear a spot just big enough to pitch the tent, but I felt safer knowing I had line of sight toward the old camp, at least in daylight. That evening, I skipped dinner. I didn't even light the stove. I didn't want any smell or light giving away where I was. I sat inside the tent with the torch off and listened. It was about 9 p.m. when I saw a dim light near the old tent. Faint, like someone holding a small torch under a coat. The light bobbed a little, moving slowly. It circled my decoy tent. Then it stopped. I couldn't see who held it, but they stood still for a long time. Then the light went out. I stayed frozen for over an hour. At 1:15 a.m., I heard movement again, but this time from behind me, deeper in the woods. Twigs snapping. Not constant, just once every few seconds. Not a deer. It was too controlled. Then silence again. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up with a small utility knife in one hand and my phone in the other, even though I had no signal. I waited until sunrise before packing up everything in silence. On the way back to the car, I stuck to the undergrowth, moving slowly and listening. I avoided the trail I had used on the way in and kept low near the stream, using trees as cover. When I reached the road, my heart sank. The back window of my car had been smashed. Nothing taken, just broken, like someone wanted to send a message. I didn't wait. I drove home with the broken window flapping in the wind. The noise was terrible. I stopped once to tape a plastic bag over it at a petrol station, and when the attendant asked what happened, I told him I must have been targeted by bored kids. I didn't believe it myself. Back home, I called the local police just to file a report about the car window. I didn't mention the tent or the man with the light or the shack across the quarry. It all sounded too scattered, and I didn't think they'd care. Nothing technically happened, right? For weeks after that, I kept thinking about that shack. I even looked it up on satellite maps. It's there. You can just barely see the roof. There's no road to it, no clear trail. Nothing official about it. Just an old structure sitting on private land beside a disused quarry. Someone lives there, or at least stays there sometimes. I haven't been back to that area since. I still camp, but only in proper sites now with people nearby. I never go alone anymore, and I always let someone know exactly where I'm going. That week in 2014 was supposed to be quiet, peaceful, a reset. Instead, it reminded me of something I hadn't thought about much before. When you go looking for complete solitude, you might find it, but you might also find someone else who wants to be alone for a reason, and they might not want to be found. I was 38 when I decided to take a long solo hunting trip deep into northern Maine. It was October 2009. The air was already dry and sharp with that kind of cold that cuts through your gear the second the sun disappears behind the trees. I'd hunted before, but never for this long and never this deep in. This time, I'd taken 2 weeks off from work, packed up my gear, and planned to hike miles into the woods where nobody bothered going anymore. Just a big stretch of wilderness bordering an old paper company's abandoned land, full of moose, bear, and whitetail. No trails, no campsites, just deep forest and silence. I parked my truck where the old logging road ended, if you could even call it a road anymore, and shouldered my heavy pack. My rifle was strapped to the side. I had my tent, sleeping bag, trail food, water filter, maps, compass, and a small axe. The hike-in took most of the day, through woods that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. It was thick with pine, spruce, and the occasional birch grove that glowed pale when the light hit just right. The ground was soft and spongy, covered in thick moss. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind that makes you feel watched. I set up camp at the edge of a small clearing near a trickling stream. It was a good spot. Water nearby, enough flat ground for my tent, trees for cover, and enough sign to tell me animals came through here. The first night was uneventful. I stayed up late cleaning gear and going over my maps. I had no cell signal, not even a bar, so I shut it off to save the battery. The only sounds were whined through the trees and the soft pop of the fire. I wasn't scared. I was used to being alone in the woods. But that night, the silence felt off. I noticed it when the wind stopped all at once, like someone turned a switch. 1 second the trees were whispering, the next they were dead still.
No birds, no insects.
Just quiet. I chalked it up to the weather. Fall does weird things up here, especially this far from towns or highways. I went to bed. The next morning, I was up before dawn. The air was cold enough to bite my fingers even through gloves. I headed out northeast of camp with just a light pack and my rifle. There were plenty of game trails and tracks, moose mostly, but also some smaller prints that looked like deer. Around mid-morning, I came across a small rise that gave me a good view over a lower stretch of forest. I glassed the tree line for half an hour but saw nothing. I ate a cold breakfast and kept moving. Around noon I found a broken deer carcass. Not gutted, not hunted, torn. Bits of fur scattered around. Legs bent the wrong way. The ribs cracked like something had crushed them. It looked fresh. Steam was still rising off it in the cold air. But there were no tracks, no bare prints, no blood trail. Nothing. The ground was too soft and mossy for a clean print, but even then you expect something. I stayed crouched there for a long while, just watching the woods. Eventually, I backed off and headed back to camp early. I couldn't shake that feeling, like the woods were too still, like something else was there and knew I was too. That night, I kept the fire going later than I normally would. I didn't hear anything, but I kept checking behind me. That strange hush came back again after midnight. No wind, no sound. Just that dead silence that didn't feel natural. I went into the tent and zipped it all the way up. My rifle stayed beside me. The third day, I didn't go as far. I stuck closer to camp and circled the area in tighter loops. I spotted another trail, something big, heavy, but still no clear tracks. Whatever it was, it didn't move like bear or moose. The spacing was odd. Long gaps, like it took long strides but sunk deep. I followed it for a little while until the woods thickened into a dark patch of fir trees. The smell hit me first, rot, like dead leaves and something sour. I turned around. Not because I was scared, I told myself, but because I didn't want to waste daylight. But I was lying to myself. Something about that patch felt wrong. I barely slept that night. Around 2 in the morning, I heard movement outside the tent. Not small movement, something heavy. Slow steps, like something walking in circles around the clearing. Not a bear. Not the way it moved. I didn't breathe. I stayed perfectly still, one hand on my rifle. The steps would come close, then drift away again. I don't know how long it lasted, but I never heard it leave. At some point, I blacked out from exhaustion. When I got out of the tent at sunrise, the fire was cold. But the ground had faint dents in a wide ring around the camp. Not deep enough for shoes or paws, just soft indentations. Too large for a man, too narrow for a bear. I wanted to pack up and go back to the truck, but something in me didn't want to walk out of those woods alone just yet. Like leaving the safety of the tent and fire made me more exposed. I told myself I'd wait one more day. That day was gray, overcast, cold. I barely hunted, just wandered, not straying far. Around late afternoon, I found something I hadn't noticed before. an old hunting blind, half collapsed and swallowed by the forest. It was just a few miles from my camp, perched in a tree that had grown sideways near a rocky slope. Looked like it hadn't been used in years. I climbed up the ladder, more out of curiosity than anything. The inside smelled of mildew, old wrappers, moldy blankets. What got me was the carving. Someone had gouged into the wooden wall inside, dozens of deep lines, all the same shape. It wasn't words, just rows of tall slashes with short crossbars near the top, like tally marks, but uneven, rough, angry. There were dozens, maybe over 100. I stared at them for a long time. Then I climbed down and left fast. That night was the worst. I didn't even try to sleep. I sat up in the tent with my back to a tree, staring at the fire through the mesh flap. I kept my rifle in my lap, safety off. Around 1 a.m., I saw movement. Not out in the trees, but behind my tent. The firelight didn't reach that far. I saw a tall shape move across the far side. Slow, deliberate.
No noise.
Just a shadow, lanky and thin, passing just outside the tent. My heart stopped. I didn't move. It circled halfway, then paused. I didn't dare breathe. It was standing right behind me, just on the other side of the canvas. I could hear my pulse thudding in my ears. I felt it more than heard it. Something breathing, shallow, close. Then the fire popped and it was gone. I unzipped the tent an inch and looked out. Nothing, just darkness and trees. The first light I packed. I didn't eat, didn't break down the fire ring. I shoved everything into my pack and left. I didn't take the trail back. I cut south, straight shot to where I knew the logging road was, through thickets and deadfall. I moved fast, not caring about noise or scent. The faster I got out, the better. Took me most of the day to reach the truck. When I did, I threw my gear in the bed without organizing it. I looked around once, just once. The woods were still, too still. I didn't stop driving until I crossed the state line back into New Hampshire. I didn't even realize how cold I was until I saw my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I hadn't eaten in a day and a half. I pulled into a rest stop and just sat in the truck, trying to breathe. Took me weeks to feel normal again. I didn't tell anyone what happened. What would I even say? That the woods were too quiet? That I saw something I couldn't explain but won't call supernatural because it didn't feel like that? Felt real. Too real. I haven't been hunting since. I sold most of my gear the following year. I still go out to trails near town sometimes, short hikes. But I don't camp. I don't go far. And I never go alone. Whatever was out there wasn't a ghost or some legend. It was real. It didn't need to be magical to scare me. It just needed to watch, to move at night, to walk circles around my camp and make me feel like prey. And that's what I remember most. Not the noise, not even the tall shadow. It's how I felt. Like I didn't belong there. Like I wasn't the hunter anymore. I was the hunted. I was 34 the year it happened. It was 2013, mid-autumn. I had taken a break from work after a rough year, burnout mainly. I was living in Durango, Colorado at the time, working construction and carpentry. I wasn't married, no kids, just a dog that had passed away the winter before, and a worn-out Ford F-150 I trusted too much. I wanted to get away from people, from noise, from the routine that had been chewing at me for years. I didn't want to stay in a cabin or a hotel. I didn't want cell service. I wanted dirt, wind, and sky. I wanted to disappear into it for a while. So I planned a solo camping trip down into northern New Mexico, the Carson National Forest specifically. Not the tourist spots, no marked campgrounds or visitor centers. Just dense forest, dry air, and isolation. I had camped alone before, but not for more than a couple of nights. This time I packed for 5 days. I brought a canvas tent, enough food to last me, a .38 revolver I only carried for animals, and a couple of old notebooks I thought I might scribble in. I didn't bring anything fancy. No GPS, no satellite phone. Just a topographic map, compass, and what I assumed was enough knowledge of the land to get by. The first day was peaceful. I parked off a narrow, barely marked trail that probably hadn't been used by anyone in months. I hiked a mile or two in, up a slow incline with dry pine needles underfoot. The forest was quiet. Just the soft rustle of wind and the occasional distant creak of tree limbs shifting. I picked a clearing near a low rock ridge, mostly flat, good cover. Felt right. I set up camp there, pitched the tent, stacked firewood, marked a perimeter in the dirt just out of habit. I even tied a bit of reflective string from one tree to another, mostly to keep my bearings in case I had to move at night. That first night passed without anything strange. I made a small fire, warmed up a can of chili, and watched the stars. I slept deep and long. I remember waking up with the sun on my face and the smell of pine thick in the air. My boots were covered in frost. Felt like a proper reset. Exactly what I needed. The second day, I hiked further out from my site, not too far, just over a ridge and down into a small ravine I had noticed on the map. There was a dried-up creek bed down there, a lot of smooth stones and twisted roots. I wandered along it, looking for animal tracks. I didn't see much, maybe deer, maybe some kind of cat, but nothing fresh. I spent a few hours walking, taking in the quiet. I didn't see a soul.
No planes o overhead. No tire tracks. No trash.
Just old trees and silence. That night was when things started to feel, not wrong exactly, but off. I had just settled into my sleeping bag, the fire down to glowing embers. The wind had picked up. I remember how it hissed through the trees. Not howling, just steady and cold. I lay there in the dark, listening to the usual night sounds. Branches shifting, some kind of small animal moving in the brush. Normal stuff, but then there was a sound that didn't quite fit. It was quiet at first, a sort of crunching like heavy footsteps, but slow and spaced out, as if someone was being deliberate. I figured it was a deer or an elk, maybe even a bear. I wasn't too concerned. The sound moved along the ridge behind my tent and then faded. But about an hour later, I heard it again. Same pacing, same crunch pause. This time it circled wider, almost like it was skirting the edge of the clearing. I sat up in my sleeping bag, held still, listening. I didn't grab the gun yet, I just listened. I heard one more crunch and then nothing, just the wind again. I must have sat there for a full half hour before I finally lay back down. I didn't fall asleep easy. The third morning, I checked the area around the camp. I expected to see some kind of track in the dirt. There wasn't anything. No scuff marks, no prints, no broken twigs. It was like nothing had come through at all. That didn't make much sense. The ground was soft in places, and I had left footprints all over. If something had walked close to the tent, I should have seen signs, but there was nothing. I tried to shrug it off, told myself maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the wind played tricks on my ears. I went about my day, hiked a new route further east. The whole time, though, I kept turning around. Not because I heard anything, just a feeling, a pressure on the back of my neck, like I wasn't completely alone. That night, I kept the fire going longer than usual. I stacked up the wood high and wide, enough to keep it burning into the early morning. I sat by it, back against a large boulder, and kept my revolver close. It was probably overkill, but something didn't feel right. Around midnight, the footsteps came back. This time, there was no mistaking it. They were closer, slower, measured. I stood up quietly and stepped around the fire, peering into the trees. I didn't use a flashlight. I didn't want to kill my night vision. I squinted into the darkness, watching for movement. First, nothing, just shapes and shadows. But then I saw it, not clearly, Not like in a movie. It was just the faintest outline, tall, maybe 6 feet or more, moving between the trees. Not running, not crouched, just walking, slow and steady. The way it moved wasn't right. It was too smooth, too deliberate. Stopped behind a tree, just out of full view. I waited, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't blink. I didn't move. I just stared at that spot, waiting for it to come out again. Didn't. I stayed up the rest of the night, walking small circles around the fire, watching the tree line. Nothing else moved. The fourth day, I packed up the essentials and kept them with me. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I didn't believe it. I knew something was out there. It wasn't an animal, not a person either, not a hiker, not a hunter. No one would be out there moving like that, in silence, staying just out of sight. Not for 3 nights in a row. That evening, before sunset, I took a walk about 100 yards out. I tried to act normal, like I was just going for another hike, but I kept my eyes peeled. I checked the dirt, the brush, the trees. At one point, I found a patch where the ground had been disturbed. Light scratches, not claw marks, but almost like fingernails dragging through the soil. Thin and shallow, but unnatural. Nothing around it, just those lines in the dirt and silence. Back at camp, I didn't bother sleeping. I kept the fire high again, but I didn't sit down. I kept moving. I watched every corner of the woods. At around 2 a.m., I heard the noise again, but this time it wasn't footsteps. It was breathing, low, steady, almost human. It came from beyond the fire's light, just outside the ring of visibility. I didn't go toward it. I just froze. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then nothing. I stayed frozen for minutes, maybe longer, until finally I grabbed my revolver and walked back to the tent. I didn't go inside. I just stood next to it, back to the canvas, eyes on the trees. I stood there until the sky started to turn gray. To first light, I packed up fast, left the tent, left most of the food, just grabbed what I needed, gun, map, compass, water, and started hiking back toward where I had parked. It should have taken 2 hours. Took 6. I don't know if I got turned around or if I just wasn't thinking clearly, but the terrain looked different. Familiar trees looked unfamiliar. The rocks I remembered didn't line up. I kept checking the compass. It pointed the right way, but the path felt wrong. Several times I felt like I was being watched. Not just watched, followed. I would hear soft rustles behind me, off to the side. Not big crashes, just little sounds, like something careful matching my pace. Once I heard what sounded like whispering, not actual words, just breath and movement. A sound low enough that I almost believed it came from inside my head. I didn't stop walking. When I finally reached my truck, I didn't waste a second. I jumped in, locked the doors, and didn't even take off my pack. I drove until I hit pavement again, then another hour past that. I didn't tell anyone when I got home. I didn't tell my brother, didn't tell my friends. I just unpacked, put the revolver back in the drawer, and tried to sleep for a few days straight. But here's the thing. A few weeks later, I went to clean out the truck. I found something wedged between the bed and the cab. A small, bone-colored shard, curved, thin, not quite a tooth, but not just a rock either. It had markings on it, scratches. I didn't remember picking it up. I didn't want to keep it, but I couldn't throw it away either. I still have it in a drawer in my garage. I've never gone camping alone again. I still think about that figure, those footsteps, the breathing just beyond the firelight. People say skinwalkers are stories, old tales, myths, but I know what I saw, or almost saw. I don't use that word, not out loud, not really. I don't need to, because I don't think it matters what it was called. It was out there, it was real, and it was watching me. I was 32 the year I drove out to Carter Ridge alone, deep in the woods of northern Arkansas. It was late October, and the weather had started to cool off just enough for the air to feel dry in the lungs. I had a few days off from work, and I wanted to clear my head, get off my phone, and spend time away from people. I liked being out there by myself, just the sound of leaves under my boots and the distant calls of birds that never seemed to come close. I'd been to Carter Ridge twice before, both times with friends. The trail that winds along the edge of the ridge is long and quiet. Not many people use it unless it's spring or summer, and even then it's mostly locals. The forest out there isn't anything special, just a dense line of old oaks, pine, and a few dry creeks that only run with water when it rains hard. But there's a peaceful stillness to that place that always made me feel safe. Or maybe safe isn't the word. Comfortable. I drove my old pickup from Little Rock, made a few stops along the way, gas, jerky, beer, batteries. I turned off the highway at an old cracked road with no sign. There used to be a wood marker that read Carter Ridge Trailhead, but the last storm knocked it down. I only knew the way because I'd memorized every turn on those narrow roads the first time I came here. You go past an abandoned silo, then take a hard right at a big rock that's shaped like a boot. That's when you know you're 10 minutes out. By the time I got to the parking area, it was already getting late. I saw no other cars, not a single tire mark in the gravel besides my own. I wasn't surprised. Most people didn't like camping this late in the year. I grabbed my backpack, locked the truck, and headed out. The trail was covered in brown leaves that had only just fallen. It was quiet. No wind, no birds, just the crunch of my own boots and the shifting of my pack with every step. The air had that dry, woody smell that comes right before winter. After about 2 hours, I veered off the trail toward a spot I'd found the year before. An open clearing with flat ground and a dead tree perfect for firewood. There was even a little ridge to one side that blocked the wind. I set up my tent, gathered a bunch of dry branches, and got a fire going. As the sun dipped below the tree line, I cooked a simple meal. Canned stew heated in a little pot over the flames. I drank a beer, leaned back, and watched the stars come out one by one. I didn't feel scared or lonely, just disconnected. It was what I needed. That night I slept okay. I woke up once, probably around 3 a.m., to what sounded like twigs snapping out in the woods. I lay there for a while, staring up at the roof of my tent, holding still, listening. But it was probably a deer. This area wasn't known for bears or anything dangerous. After a few minutes, it was quiet again. I drifted off. The next day, I hiked deeper, took a side trail that followed an old creek bed. Nothing special, just trees, rocks, fallen logs. But the farther I went, the stranger I felt. Not scared, but alert, like something was just barely off. It wasn't a sound or a smell or anything I could explain, just a kind of tightness in my chest that I couldn't shake. At one point, I stopped to drink some water and noticed a pile of rocks stacked near the creek. It looked intentional, like someone had built a small tower, 5 or 6 flat rocks neatly balanced. I assumed it was some backpacker's trail marker or art. People did stuff like that all the time. Still, I didn't like it. Something about it felt out of place. There was no path nearby, no signs of anyone else. I moved on. Later, I found another one. Same kind of thing, stacked stones, same size, same shape. This time it was next to a rotting stump way off the trail. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but after the third one, something turned in my gut. The third pile was by a dry fire ring, like someone had camped there recently. But there were no ashes, just the circle of stones, the rock stack right beside it. That night back at camp, I couldn't relax. I kept glancing at the trees beyond the fire, trying to catch movement. There was nothing, but I never once felt alone. That was the worst part. The sensation that someone was nearby, just out of view, just behind the trees. I kept the fire going longer than usual, drank another beer, and went to bed late. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night again, but this time it wasn't because of a sound. It was because I was cold, real cold. I reached for my sleeping bag zipper, and that's when I realized my tent door was open. Not halfway, not cracked, wide open. I never sleep with it open. Bugs, snakes, cold air, you just don't. I sat up fast, heart hammering, and looked out. Pitch black, silent. The fire was out. The clearing was dead still. My flashlight was right where I left it, and I grabbed it fast. I scanned the trees, the ground, the ridge. Nothing. No tracks. No sign of anything. I got out slowly, looked around the perimeter of the tent. No prints in the dirt, no broken branches. But the door had definitely been zipped open. Not ripped, not forced, just opened. I didn't sleep again that night. By morning, I had made up my mind to pack up and hike back to the truck. But when I checked my GPS and compass, something didn't add up. The direction I thought I came from was opposite of what the compass was showing. I was dead certain the trail was west of my camp, but now my compass said east. I checked it 5 times, even pulled out my phone, which still had some battery. It agreed with the compass. It didn't make sense. I don't get turned around like that. I've been in the woods my whole life. Even in fog or dark, I always have a feel for direction. But now everything felt twisted. Still, I started walking east toward what the GPS claimed was the trail. After an hour, I saw something I didn't expect. Another fire ring, another stone stack, this one fresh.
No ashes, no soot.
But the rocks looked newly moved, with clean scrape marks on the top ones. That's when it really started to feel wrong, like I was being herded, watched, led. I changed course, went north, then west, bushwhacking through trees and down logs. I ignored trails, ignored the GPS, and just moved. I was hoping to hit a road or a landmark I remembered. After 2 hours, I heard something I hadn't heard in days. A car horn. It was faint, miles off, but real. I followed that sound like it was a lifeline, weaving through the trees, checking my compass constantly. After another hour, I reached a dirt road, then finally a paved one. My legs were shaking. My head pounded. I sat down in the gravel and waited. Eventually, a truck passed and gave me a lift back to my vehicle. My truck was still there, untouched, parked under a thick layer of fallen leaves. I didn't talk to the driver who picked me up. He didn't ask questions either. I drove back to Little Rock in one stretch. When I got home, I didn't unpack right away. I didn't sleep. I just sat in my apartment with the lights on, doors locked. That was 5 years ago. I haven't gone camping since. I sold my gear. I don't hike anymore, not even on easy trails with clear signage. I've told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe I was sleepwalking. Maybe someone else had been out there and just liked stacking rocks. But deep down, I know that wasn't it. Something was wrong on that ridge. Something real. Not a ghost or a monster, just a person, maybe. Person who watched, who waited. That last night, when I found the tent door open, I didn't think much about what I might have not seen. But later, when I remembered more clearly, I realized something. There was no wind that night. No animals moving around.
No bugs.
Nothing. But the zipper on the tent door was pulled down from the inside, not the outside. I never figured out how that happened, and I don't think I want to.